Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode. What is it?
Two.
Two? Yeah,
Two.
episode. That's right, season 3, episode 2. My name's Lee. I'm from Western Australia. This week we're joined by Vickers from Canberra
Yo.
and Zach from Canada. Welcome along.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking this week. We're going to talk about three particular topics. So we're going to talk about Australia Day. We're going to talk about the Republic, which has of course been brought up by politicians at this time of the year, and we're going to talk about gay conversion therapy, as the Premier of New South Wales has indicated they want to crack down on gay
No, no,
conversion.
no. It's not the Premier of New South Wales. It's the Premier
Sorry,
of
Victoria.
Victoria.
Victoria, sorry. It's all the same to me.
We're all
East
rabid
Coast.
East Coasters,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's it. So let's talk about Australia Day slash Invasion Day, as they like to call it, on the left. How as libertarians are we supposed to think about days like Australia Day, or I guess I'm sure in Canada they have some sort of Independence Day or some sort of national day. How are we to feel about that, and particularly in light of bad things governments have done to people as a result
Indigenous
of
populations.
indigenous
Yeah.
populations as a result of European settlement.
Actually, I want to hear Zach's opinion on this because it must be interesting for you being Canadian to hear a whole bunch of Australians talk about Australia Day.
Can you give me some background on Australia Day?
Okay, so Australia Day was basically it's the 26th of January. It's when the first fleet landed here. It's effectively when the first colonists arrived in Australia. So the equivalent in the United States would be if it was the day when the Mayflower arrived. I don't know what it is in Canada, actually. What's your equivalent of that day?
We've got Victoria Day where we celebrate the Queen. I'm not sure if there's an exact analog, but that might be
Well,
related.
that's Queen's birthday for us. But essentially, it's the day. It's essentially the day that European colonization began in Australia.
Yeah.
So from I'm gonna because Lee, I presume you're on the Australia Days absolutely fine bandwagon.
No, well, I've got somewhat mixed feelings. I guess I mean, for me, I guess as a sort of relatively hardcore rights kind of guy, I kind of look at it and think, well, on one hand, yes, there is there. Well, there was, on one hand, it's sort of like yes, there was some sort of invasion that took place in the sense that Europeans came in and said, okay, we're now rulers of this place. Um, uh, the private property rights of the Aboriginal people they can get stood on. The political sort of authority of the various different tribes they can get stood on. You're now all British citizens. Tough luck.
British
Welcome to the
subjects.
British subjects. Welcome to the tribe. So on one hand, I sort of say, okay, well that's clearly not a good thing. On the other hand, I say, well, as a natural rights kind of person, and the homestead principle, there was actually plenty of land that wasn't owned. Like the notion that even a million Aboriginal people could own all of Australia, ownership being defined as, land plus labour. So it's not just that there were Aboriginal people saying this is all our land. They actually have to mix in their labour to truly own something. So there's actually plenty of unowned land. In fact, I'd argue there's plenty of unowned land right now. I mean, even 23 million people don't truly own the entire landmass of the Australian continent just because.
So I don't buy into the land plus labor argument. For me, it's about essentially whatever is being claimed, and it's not just whatever's being claimed. It's in essence whatever you can define inside your border, as long as you can defend what is contained within what you're defining, that is your property. So I'm much more that's probably closer in line with the homestead principle than what you were
Sure,
talking
yeah, I
about.
mean, like, I think that's broadly how it works out. But I think, just the notion that a small group of people can own an entire continent. Not that they were even a united group of people. Like we're talking about a bunch of different tribes, and therefore all European colonization is completely immoral. I don't think that stands any kind of principled analysis. I mean, I guess I compare it to, could the US claim the moon as their own because they landed there and they put a flag in the ground? Well, no. Like it's more than just saying this is now our stuff. So, so part of me thinks, okay,
See, I'd actually argue that they could, but to assert that, they'd actually have to have someone there to stop someone else making a claim on it.
yeah,
Well,
I
you
get.
need to. I agree with Lee that you need to improve natural resources, unowned
Yeah.
property, in order to have a claim to it. It's not simply enough to be there or to make a claim. There has to be some basis for it to be a just claim.
Mm.
So, but then what about places like Antarctica where maybe the resources are very hard to get to, or maybe there may not be any resources, or actually, no, take the moon as an example. So there might be no particular resources on the moon of any value to us. It might just be a hunk of dust. But, someone might stick a base in there for the purposes of, say, recreation or whatever.
Well, that would
But
be
it's just
land plus labor. So like it's not just natural resources. It's just they have to actually do something with the land just by virtue
Oh,
of
okay, I get where
having
you're coming
been
from.
there.
Okay, no, 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 no.
Yeah. Okay.
I get you. I get you. I get
Yeah.
you. Yeah,
So just by having virtue of
Going back to Australia Day for a second, this is part of the narrative that sort of all the problems in the world are to be laid at the blame of Western civilization. And I think it's sort of a false narrative. What we should actually be concerned with are injustices that are perpetrated today instead of that occurred 300 or 400 years ago that we are powerless to do anything about because they're in the past. So I think it's more important to ask ourselves what is going on today instead of fretting over what happened previously.
except so to an extent I can agree with that. Like I mean I'd say uh sorry saying that like the Danes have some sort of responsibility because they sent Vikings over to England, in like 890 AD, and therefore the the Danes have some sort of historical. Like I'd say that's nonsense. But we're talking about a very short period of time. We're talking about 200 years, basically 200 something years. So I think they're really, there are still descendants of people who were unjustly treated. Now, of course, there's always complexity in finding out who is a real ancestor, a descendant of those people. But like, I think there is ongoing issues right now with the deprivation of property and political rights of the Aboriginal people in Australia.
yeah.
And I think that's something you can actually fix. It won't be easy to fix. Like
Well,
like it's not an easy problem. But like I don't think it's still like, well, it's too distant in the past. We can't do anything about it. Well, I think we can actually do something about it. I don't think it ends up being what the left think it is, which is, all of Australians should, submit themselves politically to Aboriginal. I mean, that's a bit
well,
too
that's
over
not
the
what
top.
that's
But
not what the left argues. The left argues to basically treat Aboriginals as a special class of citizen. Which is ironic because 1967 was about including them in with the rest of us. A lot of the modern leftist views are about basically benevolent racism, if you want to think about it, if you
yeah,
were to put a term on it. So, for example, one of the things they want to do is they want to have we're one of the only constitutions in the world that have racial powers awarded
federal government.
to our federal government. And right up until now, the racial powers have been used to take away children from the Aboriginal people. They've been used to break up families, and recently they've been used to start creating racially based welfare programs.
Mm.
Now, what they want to do is they want to remove that racial powers doctrine, which actually has a lot of support, but then they want to replace it with basically something similar, but for benevolent sexism, where they're saying, sorry, benevolent racism, where they're saying they want to be able to make laws to benefit based on particular races.
Which I
So,
mean, like I think kind of misses the boat. Like the issue is that the Australian government, and to be fair, Australian people as well. Like it's not just like it's not like the government acted in a vacuum. Like I saw a letter just today has been floating around Facebook of somebody back in the 18 whenevers writing a letter to the chief protector of Aborigines of Western Australia, requesting a cask of arsenic to be distributed to exterminated Aborigines. Like that, it literally says, "Send cask arsenic, exterminating Aborigines, letter to follow." Like you look at there was a telegram. Like, you just go, freaking like that sort of attitude amongst Australians like was real. Like people did actually hate Aborigines and wanted to do terrible things to them. But
so
turning around and say, well, the solution is therefore let's make the government a benevolent sort of paternal, sort of rulers over the Aboriginals. It's not going to help because they're the source of the problem. The fact is we have these problems because of the government. I guess my solution, which is I guess far more radical, is to say, well, particularly in terms of remote Aboriginals, well, firstly, we need to give them back their property for realsies, not just leases from the government, but
Well,
actually
no, not
giving them
not hunting
title.
licenses, right? That's what native title is. It's basically hunting
Yeah,
licenses.
they should
Yeah.
actually be given real control of their land. But secondly, I think we actually need to have a serious conversation about the political authority of tribes, still existing tribes of Aboriginals, who say, this, particularly on their own land, they should be free to decide whether they're going to be part of Australia or not. That was something they were never given a chance to decide for themselves. And, had things been different at European colonizations, say they had settled peacefully, say they hadn't just completely sort of, ignored the tribal sort of political authorities, maybe all that still would have broken down, but at least they would have the choice. So I think we should actually move, I guess, to a model where a bit like the US model, where
Oh, really? I would have gone with the New Zealand model.
well, I'm not as familiar with that, but I mean, I think we should go a step further and actually say you have the option of becoming a truly sovereign nation.
Okay, so
Which,
yes,
which I think the
that is
right
one
would go
option.
ballistic. Someone like Andrew Bolt, who's a political commentator, Zach, conservative one, they would say, "Oh no, you can't have that. Australia's got to be united." Well, no, it never has been, because the Brits came in and said, "Screw you, Aboriginals. We're going to take all your land. We're going to take all your political rights away." And I think they should be given the chance to say, "Well, we actually want to be a totally independent nation within our own land," and I think that's totally legitimate.
How did the Canadians deal with this, Zach?
We've actually got an interesting element to Canadian law, which is that Aboriginals, we call them Aboriginals here as well, they actually receive more lenient prison sentences for the same crime by law as a means of redress. And we've got these awful reservations where crime is so rampant, and there's a lot of sort of special privileges by law, which I think it's an inappropriate redress because, it's not working, right? You're not really fostering the things you want to develop, and it's sort of an injustice to the people today who aren't in this privileged class, who are normals, I guess you could say.
Wow.
Can I just quickly sort of ask, are those reservations, are they sort of in more remote locations? Like they're not in sort of urban locations. We're talking about sort of on the fringes. There are Aboriginal reservations that the government sort of pushed them all out into.
It's a pretty big country. They're not like completely out in the boonies, but they're not in a major
Yeah.
metropolitan area either.
So it sounds a bit like Australia, where they did a similar sort of thing here. I mean, I think in our case, most of the issues are in quite remote areas. So in the state I'm in, which is Western Australia, in that sort of top third or even top half, it's hardly anybody lives there. It's not very not a very pleasant place to live, but there's lots of mineral resources. So part of the issue with Australia is you've got all these remote Aboriginal communities. There's 300 of them, and they've got 100 people each, and they're all sitting on massive mining reserves. So I guess in that regard, it's actually if they're given the chance to actually genuinely exploit the resources that are there, it's actually probably quite viable for them to live out there.
I've always thought if you want to settle land claims, there's no shortage of state-owned land that can be used for this purpose, right? But um, I think it's interesting the question of why were the Aboriginals in Australia and why were the Aboriginals in North America so undeveloped compared to the European conquerors? And I think it's very obvious. Thomas Sowell pointed this out in Intellectuals in Society, that these areas, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, were geographically cut off from trade.
Yeah.
Right. North America, we're an ocean away. Australia, it's the same thing. And excuse me, sub-Saharan Africa, you've got oceans on three sides, and then the world's largest desert on the top. So these people are completely geographically isolated, so they don't trade, and because of that, they don't develop as quickly as Europe did.
I guess it's interesting to sort of think about the different because I mean, Vickers brought up New Zealand, which I think in their case was there wasn't widespread. It wasn't like the Brits said, "Oh, we're going to colonize New Zealand." It sort of
No,
was trading posts, a bit ad hoc,
no. They
and
actually, no, they did actually initially want to conquer it. It's just the Maori people, the islanders, are actually quite formidable as a fighting force.
well, from what I
Uh,
understood, they actually managed to arm themselves as well. Like
yes,
they
yes,
from
they
traders, they got firearms, and part of
correct,
the Treaty of Waitangi, which I think is how you say it, is that actually the tribal groups were actually fighting each other, and they asked the Brits to kind of step in and resolve some of that as well. So it's quite different
correct.
where you had like where
Yep,
the Brits came into Australia and said, well, this is all now ours, and anybody who didn't like it kind of got shot.
correct.
Where New Zealand, it was warring tribes that they came in and resolved the.
Correct, which is why I said I'd prefer the New Zealand model, where they were pretty much given, like they inherited the British parliamentary system,
Mm,
while at the same time retaining their sort of indigenous cultural heritage
yeah.
component. Um, so I actually don't mind that. I don't mind having an Aboriginal integrated Westminster system. It's not a bad idea.
Mm.
I just have no idea how that would work out in an Australian context, but that would give the Aboriginals an opportunity to completely buy in to the Federation of Australia. But the alternative is obviously what you're suggesting, or the route that the United States went, which is where you would arrive to if you applied completely reductio reasoning to libertarian understandings of land rights, and that is that if land was stolen from someone, you need to recompense it in a legal fashion. And giving the indigenous people indigenous sovereignty is one way to do that. It's not the cleanest way, but it would, from a reductio reasoning component of libertarian understandings of property, that would be the direction to go.
I
So
agree that if you can prove that property was stolen, then there's the obligation to return it. But you have to be able to trace sort of a direct route.
And therein
And
lies
it's
the
dubious
yeah,
that they own the property in the first place. So
I mean,
I'm
I
not
think
sure
that I think
exactly.
the issues are probably not so much in tracking kind of the actions of Europeans, because I guess in a lot of this was very bureaucratic, especially in Australia. It was all kind of the colonisation process was very bureaucratic. It was coming from England. They had governors, all this sort of stuff. I think more of the issue would be in, you know, exactly, which areas were owned by Aboriginals. I mean, I guess in some cases you can just sort of pick all the nicest spots and say, well, this is probably where they lived, because Australia's not a very nice place to live if you don't have all the modern conveniences. So, often I guess part of the issue is that the sort of places where all the Europeans settled, that was areas which the Aboriginals did control, and that's why they fought. It's just they had spears and we had guns, and that's not a good battle to be on the wrong side of. So yeah, I think it's more just trying to track who was part of tribes and when and which land was actually owned, rather than the British end of things of their actions and where they moved to. And because I think that would all be relatively easy to sort of
but
track,
but
not relatively easy, like not easy,
but
but relatively easy.
yeah, but keep in mind the Brits. We actually have the way native title has worked for the longest time is based on British records, which were really well kept because
Mm,
we were very insistent that this place was terra nullius, the
yeah,
land that belonged to no one.
yeah,
So we were very, very eager to divvy it up and bring it all into the British
British control.
bureaucratic process.
Mm,
So I mean, we have a very good understanding, I guess, of what property was divvied up where, and we have a good idea who was dispossessed to get there.
okay, well that I guess that would mean you. I mean, part of the issue is it doesn't seem like. Well,
We
certainly,
we actually so like where our major cities are, there's absolutely no concern because we wiped out those Aboriginals. I'm not kidding. We
yeah,
There's no one of those tribes left. But where little other areas, other little towns and stuff like that, which were founded up as little farming stations that have now bloomed into towns, those might have issues where you've got Aboriginal communities there, which technically would still be the predominant landowner.
mind you, it's worth pointing out that I mean a lot of Aboriginals died because of introduced diseases, which would have happened eventually anyway. Like as soon as they started trading with anybody else, like leaving aside maliciousness on the part of European settlers, which was a legitimate thing, you know, even if they just had any contact, eventually they would have started catching all these diseases, which systematically destroyed much of Europe for hundreds of years. So Yeah, I mean, I think part of it's not just malice, but also just the environment wasn't very pleasant for Aboriginals when Europeans came. But yeah, let's move on. So let's talk about republicanism, which is probably worth talking about in the Canadian context as well. So just today, it's
Because they're
been
not a republic.
No,
yeah, they're
we're part of
constitutional monarchy like
the
us.
Yes, they
yeah.
are.
Yeah. Okay. So today, a basically a call from the premiers and so the territory leaders have called for Australia becoming a republic. For those who don't know their history, in 1999 there was a referendum that was soundly defeated um, in terms
Yep.
of asking for
Every
a
state,
republic. Yeah.
every state lost it. Yep.
But of course, this is the issue that never dies, a bit like daylight savings at a state level. So, of course, we're talking about the Republic. So, what are people's thoughts on republicanism in Australia? And Zach, if you want to talk about republicanism in Canada, it might be illustrative as well. Should we be, is it
Actually,
libertarian to support a republic?
I think it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. A republic, a constitutional monarchy, it's symbolic and it makes no real difference. So it's sort of a nonsense issue, right? That the problem isn't that you have a queen or that you have a republic. The problem is that the government asserts the authority to threaten people with force in order to compel them to do things and in order to get their money, right? This is extortion and it's criminal, and it doesn't matter what sort of makeup you put on the problem still exists.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. But I'm a notional Republican and I said this earlier in one of my status updates. I'm a notional Republican in the truest sense of the word, in that I believe that governance is a matter of public trust, and that is what republic stands for. Republic literally translates to public thing, and it sort of harks back to the days of Rome, where there was this idea that government was a concept of public trust. And that came from their overthrow of the Etruscan kings, right? Like a massive distrust for tyrannical, despots, essentially. Now, the problem with the Australian monarchist movement, sorry, Australian Republican movement, the Australian monarchist movement have an easy job. All they have to prove is whatever the whatever the Republicans are pushing, is bad. And it's easy to do because the Republican movement in Australia was largely started up by the political left, uh, who lost who lost the constitutional crisis. So I don't know if you know our history here, Zach, but we had a constitutional crisis in 1975 where the government couldn't gain supply. Now, our Governor General stepped in and sacked the Prime Minister and the government, right? Because otherwise the government would shut down. And he put whoever could guarantee supply, which was the opposition at the time, in for a caretaker period of 6 weeks and pushed to an election, right? So that the supply issue would be solved by going directly back to the Australian people. It was a double dissolution election. The opposition party won. The rest is history. But the people that originally started the Republican movement in Australia largely came from that group. So the Australian Republican model that was presented in 1999 was essentially a way that they could rig the rules of our current system so that that wouldn't happen again. And that's why this Republican model lost, because people sat there and looked at it and went like, well, this is just all about 1975.
Mm.
Right? And that's why I'm just like, well, that deserved to lose. Like, there is no way you can present a model that is based on overturning what makes logical sense uh, as a procedural decision and run with that as, hey, this is going to be our new form of government. We're getting rid of the Queen because the Queen couldn't be fired and her representative sacked the guy we liked.
Well, that might be the reasoning why the movement exists, but the language they use to cloak that sort of approach is actually in we need an Australian head of state.
But we always have an Australian head of state.
That's my point. But it's very much just an emotional appeal. It's like there's something better that we'll feel better about ourselves as a country if we have an Aussie, somebody born as an Aussie in the post of president. And I just kind of think it's not, because it's not like they can really point to the monarchy and say, well, here are these great, huge grievances. Like if you look at Obama, for example, or Bush, or any of the U.S. presidents, like in the last 100 years, you can say, well, there's all these systemic issues and corruption, and executive power overreach, and this and that and the other, and you can say, well,
yeah.
these are, and in other,
And when the Americans went to the Revolutionary War, they were pointing out exactly the same
yeah,
thing.
exactly.
Right?
So that's right. So if you go back 200 years, you could say the same about the monarchy, but you can't do that with Queen Elizabeth because she doesn't really say anything, she doesn't really do anything, she just smiles and waves, and everybody loves her, and pretty much that's what's going to be like for the foreseeable future with the British monarchy, which is actually why I think the libertarian position in the Australian context is actually for constitutional monarchy, because we spent 800 years trying to curb the power of the executive, of the monarch, and we are finally there. We've finally reached the goal, which is a monarch who sits in the corner, doesn't say anything, doesn't do anything.
I'm about to burst your bubble. I'm about to burst your bubble.
And that's what you want. Like, if we could have that everywhere, So at least in one aspect of governance, we have an idea, which is the monarch can't do anything.
Well,
and my argument is, why would you want to get rid of that and replace it with a president that you're going to spend another 800 years trying to tame? As we can see with the US, it started off very small government, and now it's become an emperor.
I will freely grant you that position. However, I would disagree with you on the fact that the executive has been curved. All we've done is shift the focus. No. So, like, while there is a lot of focus on the Queen and potential for her to do her executive reach, we don't have separation of powers.
Yeah, but see, I didn't say executive. Well, maybe if I said executive, I meant monarch. We've curved the monarch. So yes, we have a problem with the executive power, but at least it's not in the monarchy.
Now I agree with you.
Yeah. So yes, we have an issue, and I'm sure it's the same in Canada, where you've got executive power overreach, but it's coming from the government, and that's why when I talk to my non-libertarian friends, I say, look, we start like the issue is now that the representatives of the people are now the tyrants, so that's why we need to move to markets, because you can't even in a democracy, which is supposed to protect our rights, it won't protect our rights because politicians have all the same vanities as monarchs do. It will always repeat itself everywhere in history. If you give somebody power they're not accountable for, they will abuse it eventually. So yes, we have to curb the executive here, but at least we have one less politician who we don't have to spend all our time fighting, and that's the issue. Okay. If you look at US,
I'll grant you that. Yeah. I will wholly grant you that. Yeah. I'm not going to concede. I'm going to completely concede that point.
Yeah.
However, like I said, for me, I'm a notional Republican, so I'm not like this guy that goes, yeah, you know what, the Queen needs to go.
Yeah.
My entire thing is about building this public trust. And like I said, there are clear examples of where there is executive overreach, where there is circumvention of the judiciary, where there's like way too much. Like, my favorite thing is the ability of legislatures to like literally pave away civil liberties if they want. That is another pet peeve of mine. There are loads of things here and there that are examples of problems in our current system. Now, if the Republican movement was dominated by notional Republicans, that's what they would be pointing to. That's what they'd be trying to solve. But that's not what it's full of. So yes, unfortunately, it's being debated as a Queen versus President, and in which case, I definitely side with the Queen.
Yep. Yes, I mean, I'm not a monarchist.
Would the impact of republicanism in Australia be on the sort of broad commonwealth that exists? Because there is sort of ease of travel and connections throughout the Commonwealth.
It would not affect it. It would not affect it in any way. Absolutely no. So the way the Commonwealth treaties are organized. So India, for example, is a republic, right? But it's still regarded as part of. Yeah, same with South Africa. They're still regarded as part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And the treaties that you have, like, for example, I'm coming to the United States in about a month. I don't have to get a special visa for that. That's organized. That's a purely bilateral organization between Australia and the United States. Similarly, when I went to Canada, 12 years ago, same thing. Didn't need a visa. That's just an arrangement that's always existed between Canada and Australia. So yeah, I don't think that the effect on the Commonwealth is negligible.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm just gonna say, like, I'm not a, like, I think part of the problem with the monarchist movement is they're also it's about emotion for them too. So they, when you have like, it's always great like when you have royal weddings or royal babies, you see on kind of your morning TV shows or you kind of really super popular
Some
mass
monarchists are
media.
royalists.
Yeah,
Some
well,
monarchists are
and
royalists.
they'll have
They
they
advocate
have
stuff.
the monarchist and they'll have the Republican, and they'll say, and they'll basically both sides give emotional reasons for their beliefs. So it's the royalists think it's about tradition and the greatness of blah blah blah, and the Republicans are about Australian pride and we could be a real country now, and neither.
We are a real country.
Yeah, well that's what I say. it's I think we actually think this is an opportunity, these sorts of discussion opportunity to really talk about the nature of government, why government's here, and what is good in a government. Because I think that's ultimately what we should be talking about. Who gives a crap about, Kate and Will's kids, like, and how cute they are? Like, that doesn't change anybody's lives. Like, it's nice and everything, but in the end, if the monarchy or the executive in a parliament have the ability to just stamp out your rights, well, that's a bigger problem. So, yeah. Any final thoughts on republicanism that we haven't covered yet?
I think the solution is you keep the queen in her position that exists today, purely functionary, but you get rid of the prime minister. That's got to be.
Well, there's this. So I've always had this debate with people that keep talking about, the prime minister should do this, prime minister should do that. The prime minister. So in the Australian Constitution, the prime minister is not written in anywhere. There are zero mentions of the prime minister. There are mentions of the cabinet minister. There are mentions of the governor general. There are stipulations to the power of executive ministers. There are stipulations to the power of the legislature. There are stipulations to the power of the governor general. There is nothing about the prime minister. And that is why the prime minister...
And probably at that time, the governor general was the head of state, like the prime minister is today.
He's still the head of state.
No, I mean, I think the prime minister's always been kind of a like, it's always been the case that, like, it's never, like, it's sort of just a thing that's understood. It's a bit like the reserve powers of the governor general. So the governor general has the ability to do all sorts of stuff. Not much of it's actually written down. Like, it's not codified very strongly, but it's not exercised a whole lot. So it's not really even an issue. So I think it's a bit like that. One of the things I like about
it's exercised quite a bit.
Yeah. So I mean, like, a lot of stuff in the British tradition is just unwritten, sort of spoken rules, I guess.
That's true. British is inductive, so it's like it's largely brought up they'll come up with a solution and they'll say, oh wait, they'll come to a problem and go, how did we solve this last time? How did we solve problems like this in the last time? And then they sort of build it up from there, which is a very interesting way of doing it. I'm more a fan of the Roman law type of thing, so it's all, deductive logic. I kind of look at the inductive thing and go, like, that can lead to very bad decisions being carried for a long time. So, sorry, that's just me having a little bit of a gripe there. But, the office of the Prime Minister, not actually in the Constitution, it was kind of invented by politicians. Sorry, thanks for responding to that. Because it's invented by politicians, I'm like, well, is it something that really needs to exist? It's something that needs to justify itself.
I don't think it necessarily has to. I mean, I think in the end, political power kind of just exists and rules don't matter as much as how people feel about the rules. So you look at the US situation where it's the case where you've got both the Congress and the executive massively expanding the power of the state. There's probably a lot of that stuff's unconstitutional, but the attitude of the population is we want the government to do things, and so they do those things.
It's all unconstitutional because Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution enumerates the powers of the federal government. It's very restricted, right? Yeah, but none of that.
I mean, I think realpolitik in the end is the most important thing for understanding how things actually work. So you can have all the rules and guidelines and restrictions you like, but in the end, if people want more state power, the state will get more power. And if they don't like what the state does, the state will stop doing it. I guess I don't worry so much about, should rules about the prime ministership be codified, because it doesn't matter that much. In the same way,
because they won't follow it.
Yeah, and that's why King Charles. So, people talk about, well, what about King Charles? I mean, the guy is clearly a knob, like, without a doubt. He's a lefty. He's got all the left support for all the lefty causes, and yes, he did all these awful things in his personal life. But in the end, it doesn't matter how he decides he wants to act because
Well, that's
people
monarchy.
don't
You
like
don't
the
get a
monarchy.
choice.
He has no ability to really influence things because nobody likes the monarchy. Like people, in the end, I mean, they might think it's romantic and stuff, but as a political institution, we like it in a box, in the corner, and silent and seen but not heard. And I think that's why, in the end, constitutional monarchy has actually got longevity because King Charles doesn't matter what he thinks because he's in the box. King William doesn't matter what he thinks; he's in the box. All of those guys, they're in the box. We've got them
Well,
contained,
we hope that
and
they don't use their reserve powers.
well, yes, but even those like that's the thing. I mean, look at the case of '75. Whitlam was sacked when he was the polls were massively against it. That's why he didn't go for an election because he knew he was going to lose, and that was borne out by the fact that the opposition won not just that election but the next two elections. So I think it's one of those things that even a governor generals understand, I think, the limits to what they can do. And of course, there's always the potential for some madman to come up and think they can do everything. But I think generally the realpolitik is the determining factor in how these things actually play out. And I think in Australia's case, the attitude towards the monarchy and the governor general is such that they won't ever really try to pull a Swiftie because they just know that they can't. I mean, essentially, if King Charles actually tried to do something, it would be a Republican the day after, because people would be like, we're not standing for this prat with big ears one day longer. And I think that's why you won't ever see him try to expand the role back to what it was. I mean, if you go back to the monarchy today, is nothing compared to what it was, 200 years ago. Like it's just a completely different thing.
Let's go 100 years back.
Yeah, even then. So,
by the way, what is the Canadian attitude to the republic? To the monarchy.
The Queen is loved.
The Queen is loved, of course. Everybody's Elizabeth. Yeah. No. It seems I've never generally heard Canadian opinions on. You guys don't seem to have this debate as often, or at all.
There's a very tiny Republican movement that has no traction, and it's not. It never comes up. We don't.
Wow, that's amazing.
Well, see, politicians in Australia bring it up as a distraction because that's how politicians operate. So, yeah, I'm sure it happens. Yeah, there's distraction issues as well in Canadian politics where it's like, hey, we've got some bad polls going on, we've got some bad things going on. Let's throw up this issue because it's going to stir up mud and muddy the waters.
Why can't it be drugs like everywhere else? Like that's something everybody can talk about. It's just like drugs. 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 Be scared.
Yeah, but see, it's more like daylight savings. In Western Australia, it's daylight savings. So anyway, we should move on because we've got one more topic to talk about. So
that is true.
Any final thoughts? We've got a couple of minutes to finish on republicanism. Anything else?
Nah, not
okay,
really.
let's move on.
I think we've done it to death.
I feel we've exhausted the discussion.
So Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier, has flagged that they're going to crack down on gay conversion therapy. So for those who aren't fully aware what it is, it's essentially a variety of techniques, or I guess it's hard to sort of describe what it is, but essentially they're programs for people who don't want to be gay anymore and usually religiously orientated, like Christian orientated,
this makes so much more sense to me now. I was just like, wait, are people really are people really kidnapping people or something and turning them gay? Because I didn't think that could happen.
No, so it's basically for people who have
so much more sense now.
Either unwanted feelings or, it's basically for their treatments for people who have unwanted feelings, usually run by organizations that aren't necessarily medically credentialed. So I think that's part of the issue. And I think there's also there's a juvenile issue and then there's an adult issue. So I think there's two separate things. But,
okay. But is he cracking down on any other unlicensed medical institutions performing quack therapies then?
Not that
Because I would love to report my local homeopath.
No, I don't think it is. I mean, essentially it's... So I think it's... yeah, I mean, it's... So I'll just read an article on the SBS website. So the Victorian government has vowed to crack down on gay conversion therapists who claim they can cure homosexuality. There was an investigation by the Sunday Age, which some religious organisations...
Of course it was by the Age.
Yeah. So I mean...
The Age is a very left-wing paper here.
Yeah. So I mean... okay, so I might as well start since I'm a Christian. I'm a conservative Christian. And... this is obviously directed towards guys like me, people like churches that I'd be a part of would know of these organizations. So, like, I think there's two issues. Firstly, there's the juvenile adult issue. So I think when it comes to juveniles, I mean, because some of these treatments can involve like electroshock treatment, and it's actually pretty hardcore stuff. And I think in the US, it's some of the organizations that run these things almost run them like cults. So it's not just like, okay, you have these feelings you don't want, he will come and help you deal with them. It's parents pressuring their kids to go to camps that, essentially are trying to brainwash the kids to not have the feelings that they have. So I don't think that's okay. I think regulating that sort of thing might be worth it. I think when it comes to adults, though, they should be free to decide from who they see about how they feel, and like, it's just let adults decide for themselves. I think there's
Okay.
well, yeah. I mean, like,
I feel like you really want a response on what is an absolutely reasonable position to hold. I'm
well,
just like,
no. I mean, I guess, like, okay. So I think part of this is also a cultural war. So, the notion that that homosexuality is something that's unwanted is not a cool thing to say. Like, as culture essentially moved to a point where the only politically correct thing to say is it's okay to be gay, and if you feel like if you have homosexual feelings, you should act on them, and don't let anybody else tell you otherwise. Which, given the historical sort of status quo, I can understand why that's the case. But as a Christian, we have a very specific approach to sexuality that says that sex is between man and a woman within the context of marriage. So anything outside of that is not okay for Christians. So if there's somebody who is struggling with adulterous feelings, because it's not just homosexual feelings, but also somebody who's wanting to have an affair, or they are struggling with homosexuality, that's a real thing. Like, I think if a Christian feels like that and they want to get treatment, that's for them, and it's up to them to decide whether that treatment is effective or not. My experience of churches is not that, like, maybe I'm just in the wrong churches, but I don't see much pressure. Like, if somebody's came out in my church and said, I have attraction to men, a man says that, or a woman says attraction to women, I don't think there'd be people like, getting bags to sort of put them in, put over their heads to check them in the van to drive them off.
Church. You're at a very
I'm really
church.
not. I'm a pretty conservative church.
I was confirmed in the United Church, and they actually have openly gay pastors.
Yeah, see, that would never fly. Like, we wouldn't even talk to someone. Like, if somebody said, if a pastor wanted a job at our church and they're open gay, they wouldn't even get in the door. We wouldn't let them preach.
Okay, so
yeah, so it's not just the case that we're a liberal church. We're actually a very conservative church, but just that we don't hate gays. Maybe some people in the church do, but broadly speaking, my experience of churches is that they're actually relatively tolerant, I think. Obviously, it varies between churches. So if you go to there's a fundamentalist church also in my town, if you go in there and said you're gay, I think you might have some issues.
So I grew up in northwest Sydney, and like the biggest church near where I was
Hillsong.
Hillsong.
Yeah.
I do know which it is. Yeah. So
how do I not know about Hillsong? Hillsong's one of the biggest churches in the world, really. Actually, in the end.
Oh wait, you've heard of Hillsong, Zach?
No.
Okay, see, it's not that big.
No,
it's big in Australia, but it's not that big everywhere else.
Yeah.
I think its influence is vastly overstated. But that was the one I knew, and that was the one that was always in the paper for like its connections with, groups that are obsessed with basically not just keeping gay marriage banned, but like really, really horrible stuff towards the homosexual community. Almost to like I think at one stage they opposed, what was it, so we used to have gay panic as a partial defense to assault/murder, right? It was like, I panicked because I thought he was coming on to me.
Yeah.
So there was a move to make procedural changes to get rid of that, and I think the Brotherhood or some group that's affiliated with them was like spruiking the opposite side of that. I just remember it on the periphery of something being in the newspapers at the time. I don't know if that's like a big thing that they do, but they've garnered a reputation for having a not very pleasant view on homosexuality. Sorry, I'm rambling.
I mean, like in the example that they give that the Age said, there was one man who was told, if he has any unwanted thoughts, he had an elastic band on his wrist and he'd flick himself. So that's one example. The other example was a guy who was given like electroshock treatment. Like whenever he saw an image of a man, he was shown an image of a woman and a man, and when he saw the image of the man, they'd give him a shock. Like, so the first one, it's just an elastic band, big deal. Like I've used that system for other things. The second one is like, I mean, that's really extreme, but I think an adult can decide for themselves whether that's something they want to take a hold of or not. Like, and I think a lot of the issue is that you've got these people who end up just fully embracing their homosexuality, and they come out and say there's these terrible things when there's quite potentially people who found it helpful. So I guess it's, for me, I just sort of think, well, adults should be able to freely decide for themselves how they want to manage their own feelings, sexual feelings, and I don't think it's the government's job to tell them how to do that. I think when you get
the social democrat position on this issue is that homosexuality is something that you're born into, not something that you choose. And I'm not sure if this is correct or not. I don't really have a strong feeling on it either way, but they would say that it's futile to try to change your sexual orientation or your sexual preference through these therapies because it's something you're born with.
But your sexual preference actually changes through the course of your life, right? Like maybe not to the extent where you've gone from, being a happily heterosexual person to, hey, I happen to like boning people of the same gender now. It doesn't necessarily work out that way, but your preferences change over time. Like you might, as a really horny teenager, be like, I like that. I like some of that too. I like that too. I like that too. And as you grow up, you kind of hone into. Uh, I think I'm describing fetishization, but yeah, right. You kind of hone in into specific tastes and stuff like that.
sure.
And like I said, it's going to change over the course of your lifetime. So, I for me, the discussion on whether it's something you're born into or whether it's something you choose, it's wholly irrelevant.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
in the end, like even if some people believe that they were born into it, it's not the government's jobs to stop people who think otherwise. I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's actually a range of opinions on at what point homosexuality becomes sort of people's preference, whether they're born into it, whether they choose it, whether there's some mix of, there's some other thing. Well, people can have a variety of opinions, and none of them can be really necessarily proven, and all of them can be okay. Like, you can believe that it's a choice and still think it's not. You shouldn't be forcing people to. Should be prosecuting them for what they believe. It's one of those things. Like, it's not like you have to pick one thing and that determines your attitudes towards homosexual people, with people with those feelings. So
there's also the issue of there's lifestyle. There's risks associated with the homosexual lifestyle, health risks, and also maybe inferior social outcomes. So you have to, of course, we shouldn't be condemning people for being homosexual, but we shouldn't take this blasé view that no matter what you do throughout your life, you're going to have the same sort of result, right?
well,
So there's
so I actually think the social outcomes for homosexuals have improved quite drastically in the last 20 years. They've gone from being like this derided group to being like a very influential and wealthy group now. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in Australia, one of the arguments for gay adoption was essentially that the vast majority of homosexual couples are in a very high earning capacity in very stable households. And that's how we got gay adoption across the line in New South Wales. Is that, hey, like if you're looking on paper, as in we want someone who has a very stable household, who can, provide a lot of money for a child, right? Gay adoption makes perfect sense because you've got people who, on average, make a lot more than your average heterosexual couple, and at the same time, they're very stable.
And also, I mean, if you just think about the notion of prohibition, like, I mean, if you're going to prohibit a particular type of relationship, then people in those relationships, it's going to change the dynamic. A bit like, the issues around drug prohibition. Like, if you make drugs illegal, drugs become more risky, drugs become more potent.
Wait, are you saying that if we make if we make homosexuality illegal, people will make homosexuals in their bathtubs?
Yeah, that's it. No, I mean, it will change their behavior. So, you might, this maybe that. I mean, it's hard to tell because, of course, you can't really do an experiment on these sorts of things. But certainly, if you change the legal status of homosexuals, it will allow them to have different sorts of relationships than if it was all illegal.
I actually think we can, because we've got 2 states, right? And we can practice, right? We can make one state ban it, and we can make one state not ban it, and see how it works out.
Sure. Well, okay. But I mean, I think just to what was I going to say?
Laboratories of public policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back to the cultural war aspect side of things, like I think because this push against gay conversion therapy or whatever you want to call it is coming from left. I think some of it is just they don't understand Christians or how anybody could actually not want to be homosexual. Like I can, as well, I mean, I'm a regular guy, so and I'm married, and so of course I think about
So
other women.
Lee's trying to fantasize himself as a homosexual.
No, well, I guess
and going like, what would I do? What would I do other than men?
Yeah. No, just in terms of I think I think every regular person who's a Christian struggles with some sort of unwanted sexual thoughts, be it heterosexual, homosexual, and so.
Man, I'm glad I'm not Christian.
Well, I think everybody in any sort of monogamous relationship has that, or even like in every sort of relationship you have thoughts that are unwanted. Like in every aspect of life we have thoughts that are unwanted. And I think part of the problem is that the left don't understand how a Christian can say, well, my relationship with Jesus is more important than my sexual preference. Therefore, I'm going to try and change my attitude about my sexual preference in order to follow Jesus. And so I think that's another aspect of just. And I guess you might even see it with the attitude of the left towards gun owners. Like they don't understand how somebody might actually want to own a gun and could be part of a culture that thinks guns are okay, and vice versa as well. Like you get conservatives who don't understand how the left thinks, and therefore they try to ban what they don't understand because they just don't understand it.
So you know what would be great for this? And I mentioned this like in the last season, the veil of ignorance. It's like, let's just design a society where you don't know where you're going to be in that society. Right? All of a sudden, some of these policies seem very stupid to have. Anyway, I digress. I just diverted the conversation.
Thanks, John Rawls.
Anyway, I diverted the conversation to a philosophical topic that we should really have a whole episode on. But steering it right back, you did mention...
But just before we steer back, I got to say that Rawls' whole idea was idiotic, right? That because we could be born poor, we should have wealth redistribution.
No, so you would... I want to have another episode on this because there is a lot to talk about there. I know where you're coming from, and we do need to talk about this. So I will steer it back.
So you've heard it here first, people. There's going to be a John Rawls episode. Doesn't it sound so exciting? I can hear the peals of joy across the country. John Rawls!
Well, the thing is, outside of ALS, everybody else is just going, who the fuck is John Rawls?
Yeah.
But in ALS, I'm sure there's libertarians going like, whoa, are we going to take on the big one?
Yeah.
Yes, we are. yeah, we are.
Anyway, let's get back from the sidetrack into the thing that you were actually wanting to talk about.
I was actually going to steer you back towards the juvenile case because that was far more interesting for me. I'm just like, your position on adults is really, really reasonable. I'm just like, that's not contentious. Everybody should believe that adults can do whatever the fuck they want.
Yep.
But when it comes to kids, I think it becomes a little bit more problematic because they're dependents. They're not parasites, right? It's not like they're my kids. I can beat them if I want.
Yeah.
Right? That's not how it works.
And certainly in the US, you've got examples of where parents have, very conservative parents have pressured their kids to do something that they probably wouldn't have chosen if they could choose. So, or actually just force their kids to go to these conversion therapies, of which, as I said, like some of them are cult-like. They're beaten, and they're, the environment they're in is very. It's there to manipulate them. It's there to try and brainwash them. So it's a whole. I think when you get into that side of things, it's a whole other can of worms. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's actually.
Yeah. So I think some oversight is not totally out of the realm of totally unjustified. So, I guess it comes down to. I mean, really, at what point can parents abuse their kids? And under what circumstances can parents make their kids do stuff they may not choose for themselves? So if you have a kid who says to their parent, "I've got these feelings, I don't know what to do with them," and the parent says, "Okay, I've got this Christian counselor who will work you through it," I'd say that's totally okay. But when on the other scale, you've got parents who are bundling off their kids, I think even to the point of abducting them to send them to a camp that is essentially locking them up until they repudiate their sexual feelings. I think that's totally not cool. I think that should probably be illegal. I'm not thinking through the overall arching meta thing, but like it just like that's the kind of stuff where if that was illegal, I'd be like, yeah, okay, that's not totally unjustified. Um,
So let's say it's got a 18 and over only restriction, and say with the exemption of if they manage to get themselves emancipated.
yeah, sure. So I mean, like I think, um, yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, part of this is that like these services are not necessarily regulated as a regular service. Like when we're talking about these people, some of these organizations are not run by like psychologists or whatever. They just sort of run as some like there's something that's outside of kind of government control to begin with. So there's an issue of, well, do you want to bring it in under government control so they can regulate it properly? But then on the same token, they can then use that as an ideological weapon to then attack groups they don't like. So it's kind of it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Like, what do you choose? Do you choose regulation in the hope that you get it right, or do you leave the regulation away in the hope that people are free to make decisions for themselves for their kids? It's a tricky one. I don't think there's a set answer. I think you can have the right answer on both ends of the spectrum. I guess my preference would be let parents decide. I think definitely it should be that Christians, churches should think about this seriously, and pastors should think about this seriously, and Christians should have a conversation about what is acceptable in our community. I guess conservatives talk a lot about Muslims and how they should police their own in terms of terrorists. Well, I think Christians should police their own in this sort of regard. I suspect it's not a huge, widespread, every church is involved in some terrible cult-like organization that's brainwashing kids. I think it's just some churches, but I think there's definitely a place for Christian leaders to say, okay, this is what is acceptable, this is not what's acceptable. If you do what's not acceptable, we're going to kick you out of our churches. We're going to expose you for what you're doing to these kids, and what you're doing to these kids is horrific.
There is nothing about that I disagree with. I would like to see something like that, and maybe it's something you should have a discussion with your pastor about, or with what was that organization that you were working with? I can't remember the one with libertarians. Sorry, what?
Oh, the Mackin Club,
Yeah. I was going to say with libertarians and Christians. So yeah, the Mackin Club. Yeah.
I mean, I just don't think it's like. I guess the age, of course, is going to make it out to be some pernicious problem that every single church is funneling kids into, child abuse camps. Like, I've never heard of anybody going to one of these conversion therapies. Like, maybe in the US it's a lot more prominent, but I've never heard of anybody being sent to one. I definitely know of people who have spoken to counselors, but yeah, I guess the thing with the newspaper is they're going to, especially if they've got a bit of an ideological beef to work out, they're going to make it sound like under every church is a dungeon where gay kids are being turned into heterosexual straight kids, and they're being electrically shocked and all this sort of stuff. When it's probably not that big a deal.
Probably not that big a deal. Well, yeah. I have to admit I haven't heard of this occurring, but here's the thing, right? I'm just like, I live in Canberra. The crime rate here is so bloody low. And it's just, like, whenever someone goes like, oh, there's crime is rising across the country, I'm just like, where?
I guess it helps when, like, the majority of the population are, like, white-collar workers or earning, like, $200,000 a year working for the federal government. It's definitely a good way of keeping out the criminals. Well, sort of.
Well,
it's just institutionalizing.
Get on my level.
Yeah, get on my level.
So, yeah, no, yeah, so like I said, I don't want to sit there and go, well, I haven't seen it, so therefore it doesn't occur. Or I haven't seen it, therefore it mustn't be that big a problem. I'm sure there's probably communities where it's a bit of an issue. And I'm sure the homosexual community regards it as a big problem because they're looking, like, the actual effects, the studies that have shown that they've done on this show that it increases the propensity of people who go through this therapy to commit suicide. And that is objectively a bad outcome to have. So it's not as if these things are harmless, and that's my point. If you're gonna send your kids to one of these things, or if you're considering sending one of your kids to these things, please note that they're actually potentially have harmful effects. And I would say just remember that this is your kid, right? And you need to give them emotional support more than anything else.
I mean, I think... sorry, go Zach.
Guardianship is not the same thing as ownership, right?
Yeah.
Parents don't own their children. It's what you said earlier. They they care for them, they provide for them, but they don't really have the right to sort of overrule their decisions about their lives.
And I really, I mean, this is, I think this, what I'm about to mention is not just a problem for Christians. I think all people have issues with understanding kids and how kids operate and how you don't need to control kids to try and funnel an outcome. Like, you could talk about video games or pornography or, all sorts of different things. Like, people panic about kids turning out, they're all going to turn out to be, little evil shits, and so we need to strictly control their lives. Otherwise, they'll turn out to be this horrible thing. But it's really not like that. Kids, they have their own thoughts. There's, the reality is everything's multifactorial. Like, there's not one single thing. Say, well, it's bad parenting that leads to bad kids, or it's bad schools that lead to bad. Like, it's so complex. And in the end, most kids turn out all right. Most kids can think for themselves, and we just need to accept that kids. That's okay. We don't have to try and control kids. We don't have to try and manipulate kids, and that parents could just relax. The kids are going to turn out the way they're going to turn out, and it's probably going to be okay.
And try to instill positive values in them and lead by example, right?
Yep.
A lot of people they don't think that they have to really consider their own actions and their own decisions through life and the impact that's going to have on their children, right? If you smoke, your child's much more likely to smoke. It's simple monkey see, monkey do, right? So look to improving yourself instead of trying to assert authority over your child.
And just remember, 100% of children are born to straight parents.
Okay.
They've got these surrogate mothers now, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's probably not true anymore. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm sorry for quoting up false.
I was just going to say, yeah. Well, anyway, on the notion of let's be good, let's try to improve ourselves, we'll finish the episode on that one. Zach, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, Vickers, as always, it's good to have you here, and we'll be back again next week to talk more about liberty and how to make it a reality.